No matter who you are or where you go, heading outside is always worth it. Welcome to Humans Outside, where we're using the Humans Outside 365 Challenge to build a life around spending time in nature while learning from fascinating outdoor-minded guests. I'm Amy Bouchatz. I've let curiosity be my guide as a journalist for 18 years. But life, including my husband's war injuries, had burnt us out. So we moved sight unseen to Alaska to see if a change of scenery and new focus on outdoors was just the shift we needed. Since September 2017, I've spent at least 20 consecutive minutes outside every single day, no matter what, to explore how nature can change my life. Ready to hear from experts and outdoor lovers who make heading into nature just a part of who they are while we work to do the same? Let's go! As we've spent Season 5 of Humans Outside focused strongly on nearby nature, we've brushed a few times on finding or creating nature experiences in the city. If you live in an apartment building or surrounded by concrete in an area without many or large parks and a walkable space, or if you don't have a vehicle and public transportation doesn't have ready access to green space, how do you find and experience nature? Since low-income areas of cities tend to have less manicured green space, individuals who live in those neighborhoods could have an even more difficult time accessing green space areas. In Washington, D.C., the nonprofit organization City Blossoms is working to create and maintain green spaces in the form of gardens, flower and vegetable, across the city, with a focus on youth involvement. While D.C., like many cities, does have city parks with green areas, and also has several large park areas maintained by the National Park System or the U.S. Capitol or Smithsonian, they aren't necessarily near neighborhoods. And for spots like Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens and the National Arboretum, they aren't near a metro stop. And just walking through a green space may not have the same experience as at creating and maintaining a garden, as we'll hear today. Rafael Woldeab is the executive director for City Blossoms and a Washington, D.C. native. He carries a passion for helping the city's kids build a connection to nature through gardening. And today he's going to talk about nearby nature through city gardens, why it matters, and how we can leverage the lessons he's learned there to help our communities wherever we live. Rafael, welcome to Humans Outside.
Thank you, Amy. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk to you today, not just about nearby nature in cities, but because I also once upon a time lived in Washington, D.C. And so I have either I lived in a lot of places in Washington, D.C. It was the days of my youth, and so I've either lived in conjunction to noticing this issue or in this issue, or at least covered as a reporter parts of the city that did experience this issue constantly. So this is sort of a close to home feeling topic for me.
Wonderful. Wow. I can definitely relate, even though I am from DC, have definitely lived in many neighborhoods around DC, and also likewise to your experience have noticed this being an issue in our city as
Yeah.
well. So
Yeah. Which is why you work in it today.
absolutely. Absolutely. I have a direct personal connection to the work and the mission of City Blossoms, which I'm excited to talk about.
Yeah. So we start our episodes just sort of imagining ourselves in our guest's favorite outdoor space, like we're hanging out, having a conversation somewhere you know and love and treasure. So were that the case, where are we with you today?
I love that question. I would say, well, of course, any City Blossoms garden in in Washington D.C. But I would say that my story with nature begins in Massachusetts, actually, in
Hmm.
central Massachusetts, at a farm that I lived and worked on the year after I graduated from college, and that was sort of the first time that I felt a true, genuine relationship with the land I was on, with the nature around me. And so that's where I see ourselves starting our conversation here today.
Awesome. So let's hang out there and tell us more about that because, of course, we want to know how you became someone who likes to go outside and spend time in nature and why that's important to you. So, what is your nature background and story, perhaps with that farm or beyond that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I am from Washington, D.C., born and raised in the northeast part of the city in Ward 5. And the neighborhood that I grew up in and that I've lived in most of my life is right near the National Arboretum, which is a national park based in DC. And if you've been to DC, either as a native yourself or as a visitor, I'm sure the National Arboretum is one of the top places that you've been told to visit. I fortunately grew up near the Arboretum, but upon reflection, can honestly say, as a young person, did not necessarily feel a true connection to the National Arboretum. And that's no shade to the Arboretum. I absolutely love the place now. I go there very often. But growing up, for whatever reason, I I never had a strong desire to go a couple of blocks away from my house and enter this larger green space. And I must say, it probably has a lot to do with the engagement piece. I think something that I've learned throughout my time in around nature and the environment is the stewardship and belonging, especially, are really important to developing healthy, genuine relationships with nature. And it wasn't until the year after I graduated from college, 21, 22 years old, that I was looking for work and applied to several different positions in various parts of the country. And one of the first positions to get back to me and essentially recruit me was a heifer farm in central Massachusetts, sort of outside the suburbs of Worcester, or Worcester, as they say.
That's right.
I was quickly corrected when I moved up there. And long story short, this farm served both as an educational farm for the local community in that region, and also shared a lot of the work that the organization Heifer International is doing around community development and sustainable development around the world. And that was the first time that I really felt a sense of belonging, a sense of community in a green space. I engaged in a lot of farming. I engaged in a lot of livestock management. Also had some facilitation experience running educational programming, and really felt a strong connection to the food I was growing,
Mm.
cooking that food, eating that food, seeing how that made me feel, really feeling a sense of health and a sense of peace and ease in that space. And that's something that I never want to lose. So that's sort of the first time that I really felt a genuine connection to nature. And that's sort of where my story starts, I would say.
Do you think that, well, first of all, I want to talk about the National Arboretum for a little bit because
Sure.
I think that this is sort of intersects with what we're going to talk about here in a second. So, I think maybe people haven't been there because it's sort of off the beaten path. A lot of Washington, D.C. visitors don't necessarily make it past the National Mall with the Smithsonian museums, which is fine. I mean, there's more than enough to do there, right? Like so
Right.
much. And if you only have so many days and you're on the metro system, why would you make it off of there? But the National Arboretum is sort of far afield from that. It's also walled. There's a wall around it. Do you think that literal visual wall is creating a visual barrier to use? And then sort of the fact that it's not overly popular and talked about and that kind of thing by people who are visiting Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I think you're really speaking to a challenge that cities often face when it comes to equitable access to green space. So,
Mhm.
looking at a map, you see this very large green shaded area in the northeast part of the city. But when you take a closer look and you see what that green space looks like, how to access that green space, you oftentimes need a car, or you
Mhm.
need a bike. You need knowledge of that space. So someone in your community, tells you to check that space out. Oftentimes, there's disparities with who has knowledge of that space.
Mhm.
There's hours of operation,
Right.
which is challenging for the arboretum, and they have their needs around hours of operation. But after 5 p.m., the park closes. Who has time to access that park during the week before 5 p.m.? Oftentimes, that's not young folks. Oftentimes, that's not working class folks. And so, there's many different barriers to access the green space. Yes, there's a large amount of green space in Ward 5, Northeast DC, but when we're thinking about who's accessing that green space, oftentimes there's that disparity. And so that's actually some of the challenges that City Blossoms is trying to address. So I
Hmm.
appreciate you highlighting that.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of City Blossoms, tell us about that.
Yeah.
What is City Blossoms? What does it do? Give us a little bit of background.
Absolutely. So, City Blossoms is all about cultivating the well being of our communities. We do that through creative programming in kid driven gardens. So, that's essentially our mission statement. City Blossoms was founded in 2008 by two amazing Washingtonian women, Rebecca Letmos and Lola Bloom. Rebecca and Lola were living in Columbia Heights around that time period. And Columbia Heights is a majority Black, majority Latino neighborhood in Northwest DC. And an issue that they noticed in their neighborhood was this exact issue that we're discussing now, Amy, this lack of access to safe, free, green space that speaks to children, that speaks to youth, that speaks to the community in which the green space is based in. And so they started sort of an incubator project. They started a garden attached to a school in that area and saw a lot of children and youth come into that space and noticed that there was something happening there. There was artistic expression, there was self expression, there was nature play, there was a curiosity for what was growing in the space, for taking care of what was growing in the space, for taking some of that home and sharing it with community members. And so this model of creating green, accessible space that is kid driven, that is community driven, that is engaging to the folks that are living in and around the neighborhoods and communities in which the green space is located is a super successful model and has seen a lot of positive growth here in Washington, D.C. So City
Hmm.
Blossoms has grown from one site in 2008 to now we have over 30 partners across the city here in 2022. We have partnered with over 100 different projects locally and nationally. And in an average year, we reach about 10,000 children and youth through our programming. So we've seen a lot of success and a lot of sustainable growth. And we're super excited to share our story and share our approach to community well being.
Yeah. So you're using both, you mentioned a garden adjacent to a schoolyard.
Right.
Talk to me about the kinds of spaces that you're turning into these gardens, vegetable and flower gardens. Where are they empty lots? Are they previously unused garden spaces? What do those look like? Visualize or give us a visual of that if you
A-
don't mind.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the question because I would say it's all the above
Hmm.
as far as how the spaces are first generated. We partner with early childhood centers, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, community centers. Our target audience at City Blossoms are children and youth ages 2 to 19. So we're thinking about where are all of the spaces in which we find children and youth ages 2 to 19. And it's
Hmm.
typically all of these different spaces. So we partner with schools and we partner with education centers, and our green spaces can look like anything from a handful of garden pots with beautiful flowers and crops and vegetables growing out of that space with art expression around in and around those garden pots. It can look anything from sort of that end of the spectrum to a large green, vast, open green space. Thinking about our partnership with another awesome organization in DC, Dreaming Out Loud, we have a couple of partnership spaces with them where they're doing a lot of food production and it's sort
Hmm.
of a fully functioning farm. And then also in that space, we have a youth garden. And
Hmm.
that youth garden is where a lot of our children and youth can come see both the production farm and also see a space and sort of engage in a space where there's nature play and there's art and there's flowers and vegetables growing and there's education happening in that space and community celebrations. Sort of all the above. It really depends on what the needs are in the particular community or neighborhood that we're partnering in. And oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, always our approach to developing these green spaces is engaging with community, making
Hmm.
sure that our approach is community led, is kid led, is youth driven. So that's everything from what the garden space physically looks like, so the design process, all the way to what is actually being planted in those garden spaces. So it's all sort of informed by the partners that we team up with, rather than by City Blossom staff ourselves.
Right. Because that's I'm not ragging on the on the National Arboretum. It's just a different model, but let's go back to that example because we've already touched on it. So that's the difference between something like that and something like what you're doing, which is that the National Arboretum is created for a different goal, right? Like
Right.
the national park system created that to be a place that has a display of trees that grow in this environment. It's got other sort of the original Capitol building columns
Yep.
are there, right? Like just sort of art in that way. That's a different reason to have a green space. That is not, it's almost a it is a museum sort of green space in that context. And in that context, it has literal walls around it, as opposed to what you're doing, which is supposed to be a space where people are instantly connected to because they were a part of creating it. It's not somewhere they go and experience so much as it's something they have been a part of its genesis and
Absolutely.
becoming, and the garden and the people in it become at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's spot on. And that is sort of what our long term sustainable growth towards our ultimate goal of creating cities where there is abundant, accessible green space. That's how we're going to meet our goal, right? It
Mhm.
needs to start from the early childhood level. We need to have touch points with our children and youth all the way throughout their development, their leadership development, their educational development. And by the time our young folks are the leaders within their communities, these values of green space, these values of community-led green space exist,
Mhm.
right? And that's sort of what our sustainable growth model looks like and is all about. So I appreciate you highlighting that.
I wonder if there's a case for both. Like, okay, so limited resources and limited time, right? So let's say we're starting from scratch here.
Hmm.
And you have to choose, am I going to create a curated garden space? So, not unlike the National Arboretum, something that you go to and experience and has been made for you. Or am I going to spend my community limited resources on creating a space that we're all involved in producing and designing and actively reconfiguring over time? Because of course that's how especially a small garden goes, right? It's something that is redone annually in almost, and in a lot of ways, if you're planting annuals, for example, it's in the
Sure.
title. Uh, but you can constantly be changing it. Which of those is a better spend of resources, or is it, are they just two different things and you can't compare them in the way that I'm trying to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, so my initial reaction is, what's the end goal?
Mhm.
What's the purpose of the green space? Is it a green space that is achieving a specific goal of existing? Is it a green space that's trying to achieve a goal of access and inclusion for all? I think the approach to the construction of the space is critical in what your end goal wants to be. So for City Blossoms, we're thinking about green spaces that speak to the neighborhoods in which they're based in, the
Mhm.
communities in which they're based in. Raphael, who grew up in Ward 5, Northeast DC, may not exactly know or specifically know what Dimitri in Lincoln Heights, Ward 7 or Ward 8 DC might need or might want, right? So for me to come into someone else's neighborhood and curate a green space may not be speaking to what the community or the neighborhood in that green space might need. And so for City Blossoms, it's really important that when we're creating these green spaces, we're doing so with community engagement, with youth engagement.
Right.
It, I think that's sort of what comes to mind when I
Yeah.
hear that question.
Yeah, that makes sense. An interesting pondering. Um,
Absolutely.
you've mentioned equity and diversity a couple times. So let's talk about that. And your website lists those as core values of the organization. So in addition to you mentioning today, I know they're important to the organization. Give us a view though as to why those two things are important. Specifically for when we're talking about creating and maintaining garden space. You've already touched on it, but let's dial in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, equity, diversity are two very important values for City Blossoms. I think because those values exist and because they've been baked into the very fabric of the organization is why first had a touch point with the organization, and B, am now serving as executive director. So, thinking about equity specifically, we've talked about what equity means to City Blossoms. We think about equity in the sense of access. So, equitable access to green space. When someone hears that and they know the DC landscape, there might be a question mark because DC typically has a reputation for being a very green city. But as we said, when we're looking a little bit more closely at who has access, equitable access to that green space, oftentimes there's that disparity, right? A green space plopped into the middle of the city might be more accessible for some folks than for others. So, what are we doing with that space to make it speak to as many people as possible, to make it as inclusive as possible? These are always the questions that we're asking here at City Blossoms. Regarding diversity, I think just shifting focus a little bit to a different component of City Blossoms, I've really appreciated this concept of superpowers at City Blossoms. When I finished my internship in 2015 at City Blossoms, I was asked to join the board of directors. I'm 23 years old. Never thought I could be on a board, period, let alone at that age. But the
That's the age where you ask things like, "What do boards actually do?"
right? Like they don't look like me, they don't sound like me, is was what my initial interpretation
Mhm.
or feeling is, right? But the executive director at the time, Rebecca, really leaned in and met with me. We grabbed lunch and she explained the reasoning why she wanted me to join the board, right? She knows that I don't have, or maybe I don't I'm not easily able to pull in that $10,000 donation or what have you. But maybe there are other skills or other
Mhm.
superpowers that I can bring to the table that are also going to benefit the organization. That's something that I've really appreciated about City Blossoms. It's truly allowed me to tap into my own leadership style and really manifest my own leadership development because we value diversity in this much larger sense than just
Sure.
simply race and ethnicity, right?
Mhm.
It's also about the unique pieces that make us a full human being and bringing those unique pieces to the table so we can be a larger, greater. No, I think you're right. You're absolutely right. I think more brilliant community as a whole. So
Right.
that's City Blossom's approach through and through, and something I
Yeah.
really appreciate about the community.
Yeah, it's almost as if not understanding your connection or your potential connection to green space was the keys to understanding your connection to green space and the
Right.
importance of that because you had that missing piece. It's you don't know the piece is missing until the puzzle's complete. Is that a stretch? I don't know.
No, no. I think you're right. You're absolutely right. And this is actually I appreciate you bringing this up because there my story and a story of one of my colleagues who also is a staff member at City Blossoms are completely different, and yet we find ourselves appreciating the same values of equitable
Mhm.
access to green space. I grew up maybe not feeling that connection at an early age, but she grew up being, sorry, she grew up close to a City Blossoms garden
Mm.
and was actually able to have that touch point at an early age, stuck with our program, went to college, came back, and now is working at City Blossoms running our high school program.
Mm.
So two peas in a pod, and it's remained the same despite our various differences growing up, we still find ourselves in this same space. So I think it's sort of an interesting anecdote.
Yeah. Hey humans! Did you know you can officially join the Humans Outside 365 Challenge and score some really cool and exclusive challenge swag, including a finisher medal and a decal on humansoutside.com/challenge? You'll also get an outdoor challenge guide written by me for you, an exclusive challenge tracker, and insider info all year long. You don't want to be left out of this. There is never a wrong time to join the Humans Outside 365 Challenge. So get going. Join it today. Go to humansoutside.com/challenge to learn more now. Now, back to the show. So let's talk about the importance of these gardens now that we've talking about City Blossoms and what you guys are aiming at. Why do city gardens? So just from like almost a theory standpoint, right? Why do city gardens matter? And why does the act of gardening matter? And why, this three-part question, I know. Why do they especially matter to children, which is of course what your organization focuses on is youth. So why do gardens matter? And why does the act of gardening matter?
Right. Absolutely. Critical question. There is a lot of research that points to the benefits of a relationship with nature. At City Blossoms, we believe that green spaces that include gardening, that include garden education, increase relationships with nature. Why are relationships with nature beneficial? There are many holistic benefits. So, everything from sort of healthy living and healthy diets to self expression and the expression of physical activity, sort of cognitive development, thinking about nature in schools and making sure that we have gardens at schools so that our young people can have time outside, can have connections to food that they're then eating in the cafeteria. There's many different holistic benefits to access to nature, and an easy way to check that box and also check the many other boxes of healthy living, healthy diets, a connection to a more local food system, all comes from access to gardens, especially in a city that sort of functions in a way that separates us from nature. When we think about the way that our cities across America have been developed and are continuing to develop. So it's critical that we have gardens in our cities, and critical that we have kid and youth focused gardens as well, because we want to start these healthy relationships as early as possible. That's sort of the long-term vision, as I've said earlier. Starting them at an early age allows our young people to grow up with these values and then become the change makers that impact sort of long-term sustainable growth and sort of access to green space in our cities overall.
Mm. What lessons do creating, maintaining, involving local communities in city garden spaces teach about creating nearby nature in other ways? So, like, I'm thinking takeaways you see these kids or perhaps even parents find from participating in City Blossoms, or I guess kids who have become parents since you've been around long enough for that to happen, from participating in City Blossoms. And then how do they manifest back home outside the garden gate, whether that's down the block or a couple of blocks away? Like, what are the take home takeaways, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question. I think my own story and my own takeaways are actually worth highlighting. Funny enough, as an intern in 2015 at City Blossoms, I was connected to a couple of our different programs. One is our high school program, and that high school program is called Youth Entrepreneurship Cooperative. And I was connected to our community program, sort of community focused program called Community Green Spaces. And through those two experiences in our high schools, I saw firsthand and participated in a youth run garden business. So
Mm-hmm.
our youth do everything from map out how they're going to grow food, to what food they're going to be growing and what crops they're going to be growing. They are stewards of those crops. So they're doing everything from watering to maintaining to weeding to mulching to composting to adding that compost to the soil, harvesting those products or harvesting those crops, I should say, and then turning those crops into value added products that they then can sell through their own community supported agriculture program or through farmers markets. And that was so inspiring and so brilliant to be a part of. And I, as a result, ended up making my own teas at
Mm,
home. I ended up bringing food home and trying out different recipes. And I honestly feel that I'm a healthier human being as a
mhm.
result of participating in a program, even from this sort of educator perspective rather than participant perspective, was able to sort of see the benefits of participating in programming that I felt a connection to, that I felt like I was a part of. And it's
Yeah.
absolutely a brilliant approach to encouraging folks to incorporate these values in their lives.
I'm thinking about times that I have gardened. Now, I'm not a gardener. I think people have picked up on this. I kill things. It is a miracle from above that there is a Christmas cactus in my basement that is not dead yet. And it was given to me quite a bit larger than it is right now. Okay. I'm doing my best over here, guys, but it just doesn't work out. I have, when we lived in central Tennessee, or I guess close to the Kentucky Tennessee border, but up in that area. So more in the south than we do now in Alaska. Let's put it that way. The weather was hotter, and one grows a lot more vegetables earlier in the year, and there are vegetables you can grow there that just don't do well here, like tomatoes and that kind of thing. So I successfully grew some, and then they were destroyed by bugs and I gave up. Let's put it that way. So maybe I just don't have the long-term dedication that it requires. But when I was doing that, I recall feeling a connection to not just what I was eating because I was growing it, but and then flowers as well, right? Because I felt connected to these because I had planted them and I had grown them, but also an interest in sort of expanding that outside of that. Like what else, where else will this lead me? You know, a curiosity. And what I hear you describing is something akin to that, where you're personally invested in the success of something because you've quite literally had your hands in the dirt on it, and now the tentacles of that lead you to other experiments. The curiosity leads you to make that tea at home
Hmm.
or to sell those things at a market, or by virtue of the fact that you have way more zucchini than anyone could possibly need ever. you, you know, and now you feel bad about getting rid of it because you grew that, like you can't just throw it out. And so now you're finding ways to leave zucchini on your friend's doorstep. This is how that kind of thing happens. To offload in somebody's car. Um, but the connection that you're talking about there is this idea that growing things and, like I said, having your hands in the little literal dirt extends your view of possibilities beyond that garden gate because you feel a personal and emotional connection to that act.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Imagine taking a microeconomics course or a budgeting course in
Mm,
high school, sitting
mhm.
in a classroom, sterile classroom, typical sort of layout structure,
Oh, I'm envisioning. Yeah, we're
trying
here.
to trying to understand how profits and losses work, how budgeting works. Now compare that to running your own
Mhm.
garden business with your peers where you have a specific role and responsibility and you're working with other folks that you're going to school with. And you can see from start to finish, from the spring to the fall, planting to harvesting to selling, and then literally practicing those budgeting skills, those job readiness skills through the act of gardening, through the act of connections with nature. It's a very
Right.
holistic sort of approach that achieves the same goal. And I think that's sort of what City Blossom sees as, you know.
I would say it doesn't just achieve the same goal. I would contend, and I'm sure you agree with this, that it does a better job.
I I will agree with you there. I appreciate that.
But this is the great I'm gonna date myself now. This is the great lesson of Babysitter Club, okay? The books, right? Those books were sort of about drama, but mostly about a business. They're about a business plan and about these chicks who set up a business and successfully ran a business where they designed a business plan and they had schedules and they fielded shift work and all of these things, right? And they learned how to do that by having this babysitter club. Maybe now I'm stretching it beyond what what it's able to do. But having not touched those books in God knows how long, that's what I remember from them is that these chicks had this successful business. And that was remarkable from somebody who had no cash because I was 10. So it just seemed like a super good idea at the time, right? But that's what that is. That's that hands-on experience. And who among us have not struggled to understand budgeting in high school?
Right.
Who I say. So
If you're fortunate enough to even know what budgeting is by the
right.
time you're in high school,
Right.
right?
Right, exactly. What's that meme that you I'm so glad it's parallelogram season, and I took that class and in high school, it's really come in handy.
I don't know that meme, but I know that feeling.
Yeah, yeah, like, super glad that I learned about those and not taxes this parallelogram season.
Don't get me started.
Oh, relatable.
Yeah.
Alright. So, most people listening to this don't live in Washington, DC, although you and I think they're missing out. I think it's great there. I know your organization is approached fairly regularly by organizations who want to replicate what you do and do that elsewhere. You mentioned that earlier as well. I'm hoping you can give us some takeaways for individuals who want to take what you've learned through the value of gardens and use it in their own lives, like in their own yards or in their own community spaces, no matter where they live. So, Alaska, Virginia, DC, whatever. Can you maybe share 3 or 4 practical tips for doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say first and foremost, be patient.
Mm.
And I
Ah.
say this to you as well, Amy.
Yes, yes, okay.
We're not gonna snap our fingers and have a beautiful, luscious,
But why not? That's
pest
the no.
pest-free tomato row, right? There's definitely gonna be nature doing its thing, and there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from nature. So I say first and foremost, be patient. Approach your gardening or your community garden or your garden related, nature related project with patience because nature is patient. So
Mm,
that's the first and foremost lesson that I've learned. That's what sustainability is all about. Right? In a world where we're always go, 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 it can be very easy to adopt a similar approach to
mhm,
our interactions with nature and our existence in nature. And I say, try your best to work against that. I would say that regarding sort of community related gardens or community related garden development, buy-in is really important and community engagement is really important. So if you're sort of a doer and I'll just build it, go for it, try it. But if you're wondering why other folks aren't engaging in that process with you, or if other folks aren't, if you have this amazing community garden with 20, 25 plots, and you're wondering why folks in the neighborhood aren't necessarily gardening with you, ask yourself whose voice is missing in the engagement process, whose voice is missing in the outreach process, in the development of the space, because community engagement and engaging with the folks around you is really important when we're trying to build this work and build this work with folks that typically may not have access to it.
mhm,
I think don't underestimate the brilliance of children and youth as well. Our young people we might think that they might be naive. We might think that they might not have the experiences that uh, that they need in life at a very young age. But I promise you, they are not jaded. They are not clouded in their judgment. There's beauty in that innocence, and there's beauty in the way that our young people have a connection to themselves, have a connection to one another, and sort of exist in this very more human way. And so engaging our young folks and trusting our young folks and following our young folks is really important, and something that City Blossoms has found a lot of success in. So make sure that young people are in and around your decision making processes, I would say.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah,
love that. I love that point because it is easy to discredit youth. So when you were talking earlier about being 23 and on the board, I was thinking sort of in passing about the fact that it's hard to know that you don't know things at 23 until you're not 23 anymore. And so but on the flip side of that is discrediting this idea that when you are 23, you bring to the table or younger, right? In for what you're talking about with youth and garden design, you bring to the table a fresh perspective and a lack of you use the word jaded. I'm going to use the word, I don't know, spoiled. Like the world is
sure.
spoiled to you as you're older because you've experienced disappointment or whatever has colored your perspective. And so you don't have that at 23. It's infinite optimism. And so, and when you're a kid, you bring that infinite optimism to the table of whatever you do because you haven't experienced whatever works against that. So sometimes that's negative, and that's easy to see as an adult, but oftentimes it's a positive. My son, who just turned 13, brings to whatever project he's doing this belief that it is 100% going to work out however it is he wants it to work
There
out.
you go.
And then it's a process of learning that's not really how that works, or me learning that it didn't work the way I thought it was going to either, and we get to learn that together and meet maybe completely in his perspective or somewhere in the middle,
It's
and
okay,
I
right?
love it. Yeah, it's so okay, and it's one of these unexpected gifts of for me, parenting, but also I think of working with youth, that I get to leave behind my own preconceived based off of like lived experience notions, which is not to say lived experience is wrong. It's just to say that the world is not linear like that.
Absolutely.
And that's a
Absolutely.
gift to be able to learn that.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that line. The world is not linear. I'm gonna steal that.
Please do. I'm certain I didn't come up with it myself. So copyright free.
I'll I'll say one last
Yeah.
quick piece on some of the ways that folks can take some practical
Yeah.
steps towards.
Another step.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I'll say there's a lot of best practices that already exist out there,
Hmm.
whether you are looking locally or regionally or nationally. There are folks that are doing this work, that have been doing this work for a very long time. So trust in your community and
Hmm.
reach out for support. It is there. Keep trying. Don't feel like you have to, reinvent the wheel yourself. And then City Blossoms also is your neighbor, and we are your partner, whether you're in DC or whether you're in Alaska. So folks can always reach out to our organization. We have free and affordable resources for folks on our website.
Hmm.
Um, whether you're trying to start something at the early childhood level or the high school level or the community level, and we have free resources for folks to take some practical steps and best practices towards achieving that goal. So that's on our website under our free resources tab, or folks can reach out via email. The best email to reach out to, and we can sort of send your inquiry to the right person, is our info account. So that's info@cityblossoms.org. And we are more than happy to support in any way that we possibly can. So, no strings attached, we promise.
Awesome. And the website is cityblossoms.org as well. And of course, we'll have that linked in the show notes. But if you're just hanging out on your phone, want to type that in right now, go for it. Cityblossoms.org. Um, Rafael, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Do you have a piece of favorite outdoor gear or something you use for gardening or your projects or just yourself that you want to tell us about today before we close this out?
Yeah, sure. The first thing that comes to mind is, this is sort of a no-brainer, but my water bottle. I
Heck yeah.
cannot go anywhere without my water bottle. I have a 32 ounce, beautiful, I don't know if we can say brands on the show,
Oh,
but
yeah. Go for it.
no,
What do you love?
Nalgene, super easy,
Yes.
super simple.
And stickers? Is it like a sticker collection? Do you
You
sticker it up?
my old one is full of stickers, and those stickers are definitely falling off. My new one is spick and span and fresh and sticker free. It's something that I never leave behind, and it has saved me time and time again in hot summer days in
Yeah.
DC. So
My water bottle, I use a Hydro Flask at this time. It's
yeah,
very dented. I have determined that I prefer a Nalgene because it doesn't dent. My water bottle is like my security blanket.
it is.
Who am I without this thing attached to me in my hot little hand? So I completely feel that. But the reason we like to talk specific brands is for exactly what I just said, right? My Hydro Flask is very dented. If you are a dropper, I do not recommend. And you might discover you're a dropper if you have a metal water bottle that gets dented. That's my experience. So
That's great.
there you go. There
Love
you
it.
go. Okay. Last but not least, talk to us, walk us out, if you will, with a favorite outdoor moment. I like to ask guests if we could just close our eyes and imagine ourselves in a favorite outdoor moment with you, some where you love and like to imagine yourself being, I don't know, call it your happy place, call it something that just brings you joy. But where are you and what are you doing?
Love this question. So, first, you need to imagine yourself as a city boy growing up in DC, and then snap your fingers and transplant yourself to rural Massachusetts on a farm.
Hmm.
First time experiencing farm life, and it's morning. You're told that you need to do some garden chores, or sorry, some farm chores, including taking care of the livestock on the farm. And you're handed a bucket. That bucket is full of grain, livestock grain, and you're told that you're going to be leading the charge of about 50 different goats out towards pasture. And that is truly my favorite moment that I always return to because I had so much fear and joy at the same time. It's a very exhilarating experience, trying to lead a meandering path, or sorry, a meandering herd of goats down a path towards pasture as quickly as possible so they don't get distracted. It's truly the most fun experience in the world. And I'll always thank Heifer Farm for providing me with that experience. So that's my favorite outdoor moment and still remains to this day.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episodes of Humans Outside. I hope people take the time, visit cityblossoms.org, learn more about that organization, your organization, and get inspired by it because it's an inspiring thing. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate you. And we hope to hear from folks. Everyone take care and enjoy your year.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Humans Outside. If you've enjoyed this episode, give us a little love and leave a rating and review to make it easier for others to find the podcast too. What you say matters. It really truly does make a difference. And until next time, we'll see you out there.